Welcome to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Keat TV in Eureka, California. I'm your host, James Full. Before we get started, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel and podcast. Productions like this are made possible through the support of viewers and listeners like you. Our ongoing search into the strangeness and peculiarities surrounding the human experience with the other has led us down some deep rabbit holes and into fields I once dismissed as fiction and fantasy. Reality, as we've been taught, is merely one possible interpretation of an ongoing process that should include all aspects of the human experience, not merely those that fit our preconceptions. If it fails to do so, to hold all facets in play, whatever picture that emerges will be a fabrication based on exclusion and lies. Sounds like the human condition, right? But it doesn't have to be this way. Our work has amounted to shedding the bulk of these interpretations in favor of radical inclusivity and curiosity. We're trying our best to taste the full flavor of human subjectivity and find power in both similarity and difference, accepting both but favoring neither. Virtually all the mysteries we cover in this show find their source in a collective and sometimes metaphysical search for human identity and purpose, a fraught process of becoming that goes on within and without each human mind, every sparkling spirit. It's not supposed to be pleasant, and it smacks of Carl Jung's shadow work. We have to acknowledge and embrace even the most problematic parts of our nature to find true wholeness. Our species retains some rather bleak prejudices about its own constituent parts and peoples, and I have a feeling that processing this fact and learning how to better relate to one another can ultimately help untangle the truth about us and them with a capital T. Can we ever know the contents of this universe if we're still strangers to the contents of our own minds? How can we recognize the truly other amongst us when we're so bedazzled and confused by our own diversity? What do encounters with the alien reveal about ourselves? The whole notion of belonging, of others and ourselves fronting disparate and often inimical groups is woefully problematic and has been the source of much suffering and exclusion. Yet the lessons of our similarity, of our underlying humanity in the face of so many types and stripes, can be abused and deployed to minimize, control, and ultimately eradicate minority perspectives. By insisting on one viewpoint, one interpretation that sounds all the right notes of belonging and wholeness without truly respecting the variety and complexity of human experience, we shut down whole avenues of exploration and damn ourselves to a morbid kind of mediocrity. It's true of science and people. So how can we learn to be different? I'm thrilled to welcome Professor Stephen Finley to the show. He is the inaugural chair of the Department of African and African-American Studies at Louisiana State University and associate professor of African and African-American Studies. He is also the former executive director of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. He co-edited Religion of White Rage, White Workers, Religious Fervor, and the Myth of Black Racial Progress, and his monograph, In and Out of This World, Material and Extraterrestrial Bodies in the Nation of Islam, was published by Duke University Press in 2022. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Mr. Falk, and thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yes, I'm aware of your work, and you are someone who I'm glad to talk to you because there is a lot of discussion in this subject, the topic of UFOs and strangeness and all of that. How it seems like it's almost like an exclusively white obsession. And that is not the case. Having seen your presentation at Archives of the Impossible, there are lots of instances where it is actually a broader cultural phenomenon and represents something really special and powerful within the African-American community. But rather than me telling us that, what does it represent to the Black community, and what does it mean?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate being on your show and for you taking the time to give some attention to my work. The Academy can be a strange place, especially if you do work like I do, both across Black studies and religious studies. If I was a scientist, I'd probably get a lot more attention just because we live in a culture that privileges science. And so what we bring in the humanities, and again, in those particular disciplines, religious studies and Black studies is something a little different, which is why I actually appreciate the introduction that led to this conversation and the way you framed the tension between particularity and universality. I really like that, or sameness and difference, and how you hold that in tension, because that's really important. Because as you know, the UFO phenomena is a universal phenomena on one sense and one level. But like you also pointed out, it means something very different, as I found out through my work for African-American communities. And I'll just make one particular claim, and then I'll see where that takes us with your follow-up question.
Sure.
It is necessary to understand Black experience to make any sense of the UFO phenomena for African-American communities, particularly African-American religious groups for whom UFOs are central, groups like the Nation of Islam, but not solely. I mean, there are several, as you know from watching a lecture that I did, beyond the Nation of Islam, for which UFOs are important to how they understand the world and how they understand themselves. But Black experience, and by that I mean social and historical realities, including slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, particular cultural phenomena that are important for African Americans to understand the world. If you don't understand Black experience, or at least if you don't give attention to it, you're really going to miss what these UFOs mean across these African American communities.
No, so I mean, but for people who may not be familiar with what the Black community has experienced with UFOs and whatnot, do they present themselves as dramatically different phenomena, or is it the same thing dressed up for different audiences so as to reach their particular concerns and interests?
That's an important question, and I do think UFO phenomena in Black communities is on one level a different phenomena. I mean, again, you frame this conversation at the intersection of sameness and difference, and I do think that's really important. Yeah. But there are aspects of it, like you're asking, that are vastly different. And the main difference is that for groups like the Nation of Islam, or Sun Ra, for the United Nations of Islam, or Prophet Yahweh, or the UFO twins, I could go on and on. UFOs are particularly Black phenomena. Yeah. In other words, they mean something specific to Black existence, Black identity, and Black experience that isn't captured in perspectives that understand UFO phenomena as universal. So that these experiences, which I want to understand as largely religious experiences of UFOs, help them make sense of themselves outside of a world where they have experienced all kinds of violence, including discursive violence. You know, these narratives about Black as inferior, but also physical violences. And so UFOs become important for African Americans and Black people more generally to making sense of who they are, that gives them something outside of the social and the historical, right? Outside of that, something transcendent against which and through which to understand themselves and to form an identity that's not framed by anti-Blackness.
One of the things that you made in your lecture that you referred to me was the similarity between abduction phenomenon and abduction and transport. With people into UFOs, they're taken somewhere, and you pointed out the similarity between that and the slave trade.
Correct.
Can I ask what you were trying to get at with that, and how should we read that?
Well, that's the similarity between UFO abductions, and I have to come back to that term, by the way, and the slave trade are not insights that I developed myself. These are insights that come from Afrofuturists. Okay. And so one can read the beginning, the inauguration of the slave trade as an alien abduction. I mean, imagine for yourself that, you've lived for thousands of years, for millennia, on a continent where you've never seen white people. In fact, before there were white people. And all of a sudden, people who we want to understand as white show up on your shores in these ships. They're capturing you. They are, for lack of a better term, abducting you, putting you in these ships and whisking you away to another world, across a vast ocean. And I mean, if that's not an alien abduction, what is? You've never seen these people before. You don't know what to make of them, right? Yeah. Africans, tried to make sense of them by in some ways thinking that they were ancestors, dead ancestors who had returned. And so they initially mythologized the presence of white people on the shores of Africa. But all of a sudden, you're in the hull of this dark ship, and you experience 3 months or more if you survive in the hull of a ship, and this temporal and spatial dislocation and disorientation, and all of a sudden, if you survived it, you wake up and you're in another world. I mean, what else can we call that? And that's at the very heart of modernity. And so in that sense, we can see UFOs as at least analogous in some ways to how we got here, right? That's really, we can unpack that in so many ways, but
Absolutely.
At least analogous as how we got to our current world in the modern age.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people attribute some sort of omniscience to the other, the alien in the UFOs and whatnot. I mean, if they are at some point are like outside of time and able to see the whole picture, or in some level more knowledgeable than we are, then you would think that similarity is intentional.
It's definitely intentional. And again, there's a lot of research on whiteness as divine. And and that, that'll help us as we think through this too, this idea that the abductors have a broader sense and a deeper sense of knowledge than those who are abducted. Is also analogous to white supremacists in white supremacy in the modern age as well.
Yeah, so I mean, but if that is the case, do you have any thoughts about why they? I mean, it's sort of the the forever question in this space, but I mean, why would they be making that connection?
You'll have to tell me who is the they. You mean those who were taken,
or those who are taking? Like, what's the point of making that similarity, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask.
Sure, because that's what they were taught. I mean, for hundreds of years, that's what we have been taught. Is that knowledge that comes from the West, that history doesn't begin until the encounter with Europeans, until the encounter with Western writing and historiography. And I mean, it's been inculcated for hundreds of years in all the institutions, let alone academia. I mean, even in my field, which is religious studies, my primary field, when you look at the canon, who are the people who tell us what religion is and what it means? The theorists, they're 95%, if not more, white thinkers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's the way it is in probably every discipline, except disciplines like Black studies or maybe post-colonial studies. And so, I mean, it's everywhere, especially, in the West and especially in the United States.
One of the things that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is that there is this sense among a lot of UFO and experiencers of many stripes that the underlying message behind the UFO contact experience is that there is a sort of universal humanity, and that it's trying to encourage us to cohere as a species. But the messages that you point to from people in the African-American community who've had these experiences, it seems like it's more empowering and transcendent from their racial experience rather than being more inclusive of everybody. And I know that inclusion argument can be abused in a lot of different ways and disempower people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the universal message is kind of an all lives matter kind of argument. It's kind of dismissive. And what I'm trying to understand, and I can't say that I do understand, I'm working toward that, and I'm asking others to think through with me, is why does it mean the particular things that you pointed out? Why does it have that is these UFO experiences and encounters? Why do they have the kind of meaning for Black people in the United States that is very distinct, that can't be cast and captured by the universal narratives that you point out? I mean, these are experiences that Black people are particularly using to think about themselves over against white supremacy and white racial terror, such as slavery and lynchings and structural anti-Blackness in the West. So it's not a universal in that sense, which means it cuts across the prevailing narratives in UFO studies from a variety of disciplines. And I'm asking people to think with me why it is the case, but also how can we think about what the Black UFO encounters offer, or at least how they cast the meaning, African Americans, that is, the meaning of UFO encounters in Black experience over against these universal narratives. What are we to do about that? And I'm asking people to help me think about that as we think about the big picture. Yeah. The big picture of these UFO encounters that have occurred across time and in various geographic spaces. What do we do with this other part over here? Say from Native Americans and African Americans that has particular meaning for them. And that's the question that I'm asking, because the universal narratives about becoming a better humanity and so on sort of fall apart in these narratives. Yeah. They don't hold. But I also want to say this is also why you don't find the word abduction in these African American experiences of UFOs. So I used the term in the Archives of the Impossible lecture, but I did bracket the term as problematic, while at the same time, I wanted people to think with me about this idea of abduction, particularly starting with the slave trade. So we might think of even different ways and a different linguistics and grammar to try to talk about these African American experiences where this other grammar might not hold for what they're experiencing and how they're talking about it.
Yeah. Do you think that you mentioned how there's a similarity between abduction and the slave trade and that sort of thing? Are there things in the relationship that most experiencers have with the alien that people who are white or not Black, don't have that cultural experience, can learn a little bit about the perspective of the Black community? I mean, does that sound flippant? I don't mean it to be.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about the question and how to formulate an answer that will be helpful, because I do think that UFO encounters in the Black experience, there are some things that are unique. One of the things that are unique is that they experience the alien other as not an alien other, as the familiar. And so they want to cast any consciousness, embodied or otherwise, that they experience as related to who they are.
So they're seeing African-American pilots or whatever. Yeah, right.
They're seeing Black pilots when they have these, what would that be? Like a CE-4 or something like that.
Yeah.
When they see pilots in whatever these phenomena are as Black. Now, what Black means is really complicated, because it's not always what we think it means, say, in the United States. But they almost always see the other as the same. So it's much more of a uniting or a coming together or something that unifies the bifurcation or brokenness in Black identity. There's a certain wholeness that these UFO experiences represent for those who encounter them. That doesn't scare them. So you rarely hear, if at all, in things like psychic surgery or violence. It's always, now we have a better sense of who we are, right? We have a better sense of who we are. Our real identity can only be known through the cosmos, not through these narratives of Black criminality, Black inferiority, and so on. And so what white people who study UFOs get from that, I can't say. I mean, they have to think through that and think about what it does for how they understand UFOs and how they want to theorize. But this is how African Americans are thinking about it. They see these the other as familial and familiar, and to be specific, as Black.
Yeah. It's interesting because one of the anecdotes that you reported in that talk, you were just saying that for the twins, I think it was, that seeing a black pilot was empowering and sort of revealed to them potential that they hadn't explored before or hadn't encountered in that way before. And it seemed to, like you say, strengthen their own identity and the possibilities of their own lives, sort of reversing the pressures that are the greater culture puts on Black people, right?
That's right. And in that case, it wasn't just race, it was also how we want to understand gender.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because for them, it empowered their own perspective and self-respect as Black women, because they experienced the other as beautiful Black women. And ironically, since we're doing this show, they called them galactics. The beings that they the beings that they encountered. So you're right. And again, what we're trying to get at here is what does that mean in the particular sense for Black people? What does that also do for how we understand UFOs, how we talk about them, how we theorize them? And the big question is for me, and I can't answer it, how does this help us think about the nature of reality? Yeah. And in some ways, I think that's what we're all after. I mean, we all have a sense that UFOs say something about the nature of reality.
Yeah.
That escapes us in popular discourses in the modern age. That this tells us something ultimately about who we are and about the nature of our world. And that's the big question. But they're asking that same question. It's just that Black people aren't marginal in whatever that answer is. They're significant to whatever that grand narrative about the universe is, and sometimes central to it.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts or concerns about the sort of the white supremacist roots of some ufological tropes? I mean, George Pelley and those guys, they were all the silver shirts, and that led into, George Adamski, and there's just been a lot of roots going into, the Nazism and then coming out into the flying saucer movement. Do you think that, do you sense from your current position that is lingering? And what are your thoughts about it? How can we shed it if we can?
I wish I could answer that question. How can we shed some of the occult and ufological interpretations of white supremacy? I'm not sure I know what to do with that.
Yeah.
Perhaps there's something about the phenomenon more broadly that we have to push ourselves to think about. Perhaps there is something about the encounter where there's a gap between the experience and the meaning that human beings might add to that. That could be used for good or for bad. That some white supremacist groups are using to support white supremacy, where other groups might be thinking about it much more in terms of a liberation from a world that hasn't offered freedom and fulfillment. It's a question that we have to think about, but that I don't have an answer. I just have more questions like you do.
Yeah, and that's sort of the nature of that beast. I mean, it's such a transcendent problem in all kinds of realms, politically right now, obviously, and everything else that's going on. It's rampant. Some of the people who follow the UFO topic are also in that sort of alt-right movement, and there is an adjacency among some of it. Does that concern you with the overall subject? I mean, how would you caution people to approach things that they're hearing on the internet that may be, conspiratorial in nature, that smack of, someone's theory that they've concocted in their mom's basement or whatever, but may have some truth where the UFO phenomenon is concerned, but then you're going into territory where our critical thinking skills might be relaxed, and then suddenly QAnon or something like that begins to seem appealing. I mean, I guess I'm just asking you to advise people to be critical thinkers, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the answer's in the question. I actually think you've already answered the question. But the internet and social media are fraught with all kinds of traps and dangers. I mean, even with respect to the groups that I study, I tell people you have to be really careful about what you find on the internet, because much of it is almost all of it is inaccurate with respect to the kind of work that I do in African American religion, and UFOs and esotericism and the occult. And so we all have to be very, very careful. But I guess the one solution to that might be you actually have to read really credible literature. Some of that is scholarly. Some of that isn't necessarily scholarly. But then the other important part is knowing people. I mean, when you know people in some of these movements, you get a very different perspective. I'm not talking about like the QAnon or anything. I'm talking about the work that I do. You get a very, very different perspective of them and how they live their lives and what's important to them and what all this might mean to them than you would from the internet. So, I mean, we really just have to be careful. We really have to be diligent. And to your point, critical thinking is really, really important. We have to be able to discern between the conspiratorial and the mythological, which isn't always bad, right? I mean, if you want to understand myth as this, narrative, this symbolic narrative that helps people make the world coherent, which may not be historical or scientific, but it's important for them to make sense of their world, then mythology isn't a bad thing. But we have to understand the difference between mythology and the historical and the social, but also understand that the mythological can also be important to understanding how people were trying to make sense of a world that is utterly absurd. I mean, how does one make sense of slavery? I mean, how does one make sense of the nearly 1 century of racialized lynching? After Reconstruction, around 1865, lynching became almost exclusively a racialized, anti-Black violent phenomenon. I mean, what do we do with that? Where even though in some cases there were laws against it, no one was ever arrested or prosecuted for that. How do we make sense of that? And sometimes, we have to create narratives to help us make sense of that, which can be true, even though they're not historical or scientific. In other words, the symbolism expresses some truth of the experience as it tries to make sense of it. And so we have to ask people to dig deeper and to be more self-aware and more open-minded, and frankly, to have a bigger heart when they're thinking about other communities and what these experiences, these violent experiences have done to them. Therefore, being in a position to make better sense of what they're doing and saying in their own encounters with these, what they're calling UFOs very often.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned slavery and the lynching, and that continues today. I mean, if we look at our prison industrial complex and the Black bodies that are in prison and the system that shuffles them there as a matter of course because of, I don't know why, racism, I guess, institutional racism would be probably the root cause, but it's not like that's something that's gone away, even though we like to tell ourselves that's the case. One of the interesting things that you just said is that we have to construct narratives that may be true, but they may not be historical or scientific or whatever. And that goes to something that I've been thinking about, which is ways of knowing.
Yeah.
We live in a culture where we have an academy and we have scientists and others who tell us how it's okay to think about things.
That's right.
And different cultures have different authorities.
That's right.
The main culture doesn't necessarily respect or appreciate the sources from, minority cultures, for lack of a better term. Can you talk about that pressure? And does the UFO phenomenon represent a flexing of that, of like the Black community trying to push against that a little bit, or all communities, because it is a universal phenomenon?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an important point. And the point you made about this, this hegemony of knowledge, one form of knowledge being superior to where we'll pathologize other forms of knowledge that come from communities that have been oppressed, again, is itself a form of violence. And we don't call that out enough. But you alluded to the scientific community, and in some ways, they're the biggest perpetrators.
Yes, absolutely.
Of that. Because for them, there's one way of knowing, And it's the way of knowing. And I know science is broad, and I know it's not all scientists. I know physicists who I can have an everyday conversation about this, and they totally get it. And they're across physics and astronomy and all kinds of disciplines. I think I probably know more scientists than probably many folks in religious studies and Black studies because of the nature of my work. And there are some who are very open-minded. But even they'll say that they're marginalized within scientific communities because they want to be more open to these other ways of knowing, not just those that science tells us are appropriate. In fact, they'd like to expand science, and they find challenges there. And so to the other part of your question, yeah, I mean, communities find alternate ways of making meaning, which are really important and which are valid, which help them make sense of the world, which guide them through their lives, which help them form an ethics that allow them to live in a world with others. And these are ways of pushing against these dominant narratives, not just science, but these narratives that say that these marginalized communities don't have anything to offer the world in the ultimate sense, that they have little to nothing to say, not just about UFOs, but about the nature of the world. And it renders them savage in many cases and archaic.
Primitive, right?
And that's right. Without realizing that even the dominant narratives are dependent on these narratives that they're dismissing. In other words, you can't have the savage without the civilized.
Yeah.
Right. When you talk about civilization, it always contains the savage because you're constructing a narrative and a way of understanding the world over against the so-called savage and the primitive.
Yeah.
Right. So they're always there. It's just, we don't acknowledge those forms of knowledge and the fact that in many ways the modern is reacting to and constructing over against those earlier ways and archaic ways of knowing.
One of the things I'm curious about, and I'm hoping that you can speak to this a little bit, is there's the Doon Tribe, and there's other instances where there is a lot of celestial or spiritual knowledge that's been passed on in African tribes, and it's also happened in Native American tribes, and this knowledge often gets lost. But can you sort of highlight for us instances where you think that there has been insight from peoples in Africa that we often as a culture overlook and don't identify as such?
Well, I'm gonna suggest that you have a conversation with my good friend Marcus Red.
Okay.
Who is an Egyptologist, but also does a lot of work on West African mythology, particularly that in Nigeria. But he could also talk about the Dogons of Mali, who you referenced there, and bring that together with Sun Ra in a really complicated and rich way that I think you would appreciate.
Okay.
If he was your guest, he can answer that question much better than I can, because I'm not sure that I can answer that question, except to acknowledge, like you already did, that ancient folks like the Dogon have said very interesting things about the cosmos, in particular stars, that science later caught up to and said they were right. And on top of that, how could they know this? Right? How could they know about the density of stars, particular stars and so on? I don't know how they come about knowledge like that. I think that's an important question.
Yeah.
But to the point you make, I think it's an important question because I think there's something there that we're missing, that has to be captured. Maybe it was a different way of understanding the world. Maybe they were connected to a consciousness. That's an essential part of the world and the universe that the West bifurcated, that it disconnected us from. I just think it's an important question, and I think there's something there to be gained rather than jettisoned. And I think that's really why you're asking the question. I
And it
just
goes
wish I
back to
had
that.
more to say about it.
Oh, and I appreciate your answer. And that name, if you can email it to me later, I would love to have that conversation. I think that it
Sure, I'll be
sounds
happy to.
utterly fascinating. But it goes back to that thing of other ways of knowing, right? Like we can only learn by taking things apart in the materialist paradigm, right? Like I think we
Mhm.
deconstruct everything, throw it on the table, and if we can put it back together again, then we say we know how it works. But there are other more holistic ways of knowing, and that typically involves modes of consciousness and that sorts of thing. But it comes from other cultures, and it's something that we're being told from 1,000 different directions that there is payoff by pursuing knowledge in those routes, but we tend to ignore it or belittle it because it doesn't fit within how we conceive of the human
Yeah,
mind, the human
yeah,
soul, and
yeah,
that's unfortunate.
yeah. And I want to echo what you've just said, and and emphasize the flip you made there just a little bit more, rather than looking at those cultures, or in addition to looking at those cultures and asking what can we gain? How do they have this knowledge that through our modern lens seems so valid and acute and important? And I want to flip that and say, what happened to us? I want us to think about that. I want us to push Western self-awareness or the lack of self-awareness. I want us to ask, what happened to us?
Yeah.
Why are we so bifurcated? Why do we split ourselves in such a way that we only understand the world in materialist terms, and that we have difficulty understanding the world as more than material? I mean, that's what I want us to push, such that material gain that leads to all kinds of things like war and slavery and genocide becomes so normal in the Western world, right? That's the question that I want us to push, so that in many ways I want to elevate what the West would call the primitive, to the point where it forces us to ask questions about modernity or post-modernity and all the materialist ways and capitalist ways that the West functions, that give way to all kinds of violences that are just due course for how we do business in the West, that we don't seem to be able to disrupt and bring to an end. Right. So I want to push that. And I think the so-called primitive or the savage, to use these 19th century ethnological terms about, the folks you're asking about, Native Americans, Africans, and so on, push me. And I think push us to think about that.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, what does modernity give us other than a superior attitude toward these others, these communities, but also a lot of materialism that leads to all kinds of violence? We can't solve hunger. We can't solve war. We can't solve homelessness, right? And so, I mean, what is our superiority?
Yeah, exactly right.
And I think that there's something here in the so-called primitive, in these alternate ways of knowing the universe and each other, as well as a Black person ourselves, that I think has something to offer the world. And W.E. Du Bois actually he pushed for this in his very famous essay called, it was actually a lecture, I think it was 1896, called The Conservation of the Races, that there were gifts that each group had to offer for Du Bois to humanity, to which there was an ultimate fulfillment of the human family. So he didn't want to do away, with some of these differences, right? With some of what these cultures, not just Black or primitive, but all cultures could offer. He thought there was something valuable that they all had to offer, that had something to do with ultimately where we're going, which I'll just call human fulfillment.
Yeah. And that's a very enlightened attitude. It also, this whole conversation makes me, I mean, I think a lot of times people don't realize the level of psychological violence that occurred with the slave trade, African Americans, and also Native Americans, and any oppressed tribal group that is absorbed by and dislocated by a greater culture. You go from having this holistic, I mean, I don't know how to describe it necessarily, but an alternative way of knowing that is more organic and inclusive of each individual, it seems like. And then you throw them into a materialist culture where the motivators are all different, everything is changed, and it's a much more selfishly operating kind of paradigm. That's got to be agony. I mean, I can't imagine the dislocation that
Yeah,
goes along with that. And I think that's something that we miss a lot. That
yeah,
spiritual
I do too.
dislocation is, hugely problematic even today.
I do too. Yeah, but I just want to say one thing. Even though I agree with everything you just said, I
Please, yeah,
don't
yeah,
want to act like these communities were perfect.
sure,
I'm simply saying that they had something to offer us in this modern age that we're missing because our epistemologies marginalize their ways of knowing.
yeah,
That's all I want to add, and that I think by embracing these other ways of knowing, or at least pursuing these other ways of knowing, that we stand to capture parts of ourselves that have been cut off and bifurcated by a West and a modernity that has split us into self and other in such violent ways. And I think there's something of value there. And lastly, let's not act like so-called civilization was necessarily a good thing. Civilization means violence
yeah,
and war. I mean, when the term came into existence, I mean, it was already in reference only to European nations, in particular, in the colonial age. So, I mean, we even have to look at our language and how we talk about the modern world, how we talk about ourselves, and I think that's one thing that we're missing. And this is why I think the work of Jeff Kripal and others is so important, because they're pushing us to I think what Jeff might call a radical reflexivity, right? This profound sense of self-awareness, to where we see the world more for what it is. Not that we dismiss difference, because difference is important, but that we hold difference and sameness in tension. I
yeah,
think that's where it's going. And
yeah,
that tension is highly productive in terms of what it can offer humanity. And I think that's also what I'm saying too.
yeah. It's interesting that with the UFO subject, so many of the encounters seem to be working to undermine existing power dynamics.
That's right.
There are a lot of people who are, abductees or experiencers, and they get the sense or the message that, the UFO occupants are describing a reality where there are elites who are in power, and that is a huge part of what the problem is with human culture, and we need to recognize that and make it more just and equitable all around. Um, do you have any sense of that, and to what purpose, in your mind, could that be working for? Does that make
I
sense?
think that yeah, I think it does, and I think it's an important point again, and I think even the Black UFO traditions could be read as suggesting something like what you said,
Absolutely.
that
Yeah, yeah.
that the way we've understood the world in terms of elite and non-elite, or elite and impoverished or oppressed, is actually not the nature of the world. That there's something important actually on what we might see as the bottom,
Yeah.
and something maybe even corrupted among what we might see as the dominant, or the normative elite. And I think maybe that's something else that we can get from these traditions. Again, like you said, Native American, African American, and so on, that are really important. And that's why I think giving attention to how these groups talk about themselves, how they mythologize the world, how they make sense of UFO experiences. I mean, some of them are calling them UFOs, some of them are not. That's our language.
Yeah.
It can be really important and really productive to helping us understand ourselves, helping us understand, at least in part, ways forward that if they're not nonviolent, or at least less violent, at least more fruitful, more egalitarian and democratic. And I appreciate you raising that point, because I do think we get that. And in the groups that I mentioned, Black people aren't at the bottom as they are, say, in the human taxonomy of modernity.
Yeah.
They're really significant and central. So there's there's not even a flip in many of these traditions. It's not that they're on top and they wish to dominate. It's that their experiences tell us something as we move their experiences more to the center and try to make sense of them and take them seriously about how fucked up the world is.
Yeah.
And how we've taken for granted that this is the way the world has to be.
Yeah.
Especially in the current hierarchy and taxonomic way we want to rank and understand human beings and the way we see these social arrangements, particularly in America, as so normal and fixed, right? Like that this is a given. This is just the way it is. This is the way it has to be. Yeah. For me, they offer something disruptive in that kind of narrative, that kind of way of understanding the world as fixed. The world can be different. Yeah. The world can change. It doesn't have to be imperialistic. It doesn't have to be capitalistic. It doesn't have to be violent. I do think we get that from some of these narratives, that the world doesn't have to be dominated by white, European, American, or rich versus poor, and so on. That there are others who are actually quite important cosmically, right? And maybe we should think about what that might mean to move folks from the margins to the center. What mechanisms might we imagine that might help us think about a world where there isn't that kind of hierarchy, where there aren't these margins, right? I think they absolutely help us, help me at least, think about those possibilities.
Yeah, and I think it unlocks all kinds of potentials socially, culturally, where we can. I mean, when we live today in, the world that we're living in, it seems like there are so many inflexibilities. Like, I mean, with the power dynamics, like we've been talking about, and all kinds of other things where the world is set, and there's a lot of momentum behind it, and there's not going to be a whole lot of changing going on because people are locked into their roles. But something like the UFO phenomenon and individual UFO encounter experiences throws out all expectation about what the world actually is. And even if it's not on that topic directly, it enables new thinking because you're thrown out of your old cage. You know what I mean? And it opens up a lot of possibilities.
I think so, but I wonder what has to happen for us to be able to consider those possibilities that you raise.
Yeah.
Is it something like the flip? Like Jeff Kripal is writing about?
Jeff Kripal, yeah.
Or is there something beyond a cosmic or occult experience or an experience with UFOs that we can do every day? Is there a basic capacity that unlocks a kind of compassion that might allow us just to be open to what others are saying? I'm not sure that's the case. It's just a question.
It's a good question.
Because the question is, I mean, to the point you were making, but how do we get there? How do we become open to what these groups might have to offer that might help us think about a world very different than the one that we now inhabit and continue to reproduce? That's the question that's important at this point.
Yeah, and that's a question. I mean, I come back to repeatedly. It's like how I've had a powerful experience with this stuff, and a lot of people have, and I feel like it's changed my life and perspective for the better. And I don't want to necessarily force people into having a similar experience, but I think that becoming more open and learning, like what you said, could be hugely transformative for a culture where that's not what we're doing on an average day. You know what I mean? Yeah. And how do we spur that conversation, and how do we spread that experience so that we can be a more inclusive and just society? Yeah. That's the $1 million question, right?
It's a tough question. And on a basic level, I'll just tell you, one of the things I do is continue to do the work that I do.
Yeah.
And it's not popular work in the academy. Even in my primary field of African-American religious studies, I'm an outlier.
Yeah.
I find many of the people who are interested in talking to me are folks who study esotericism, are folks who consider themselves experiencers, and are folks in Black studies, more broadly understood. And the folks in my primary field, they don't really know what to do with what I do academically and intellectually either. Nor does the Academy in general. I mean, and one of the things I keep mentioning Jeff. Jeff is such a good friend. One of the things Jeff says is that we get to say what we want in the study of religion because nobody gives a shit about what we say, right? And there's some truth to that. There's a certain freedom that I think I have doubly at the intersection of Black studies and religious studies that a physicist couldn't say because his career would be in jeopardy.
Yeah.
And so there's a certain space that I have in the margins, at the intersection of multiple marginalities. And I've created a space for myself where I can do the kind of work that I want to do. And frankly, not give a shit what people think one way or another. Yeah. And that's really my point. Because if there's no grand cosmic encounter, right, that flips humanity, that makes them very, very different than how we have existed and lived with one another to this point, then what we can do, maybe the only thing we can do is do the small things, do the work we believe in, do the writing that we think is true, do the writing that we think is important, because it's important, not knowing what the outcome will be, right? I don't know that the work that I do will change how anybody sees the world. I don't know if it will change how anybody sees themselves. I don't know. I just know that I'm doing something important and nobody can convince me otherwise. The Academy more broadly, the university where I work, LSU, or anyone. And so I do this work hoping that it connects with someone's experiences, or that it influences them to seek deeper.
Yeah.
And I just do it because I have to. And in that sense, and this is the last thing I'll say, in that sense, it's more like an art form.
Yeah.
That we do this work, and I do this work because I have to.
Yeah.
If an artwork doesn't sell, it doesn't sell. If my books don't sell, I mean, I want them to, fine. If nobody reads my articles, I want them to, but fine. I do this work because I have to. And there's a small hope that it makes a difference.
Yeah, it's a calling, in other words, and
it's definitely vocational. So let me say something about that. It doesn't mean that I shouldn't be regarded as a superior scholar, an important scholar. I think I am. There's no doubt about it. But it doesn't mean because I see my work as vocational, and I do, that I shouldn't be paid in the same way as others because I do this as a sense of calling. No, I mean, and the Academy is like that. It's very hierarchical. You're going to get paid a lot more in the sciences than someone like me, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Science is caught up in the same hierarchies and the same problem. The Academy is caught up in the same hierarchies and the same problems that you find in the world. At the same time, yes, I'm going to do this work no matter what because it is a calling for me. I have to do it, hoping that it means something to someone, that it makes someone's life different, that it helps them to make sense of themselves and their experience, or the world might call them crazy.
Yeah. A couple of follow-up final questions. We've got a couple more minutes, and a couple things I wanted to touch on. A lot of people misunderstand, I think, or maybe understand the role that the UFOs play in the Nation of Islam's theology. Can you briefly explain what that role is and how people should think about it, rather than just thinking they're a bunch of UFO crazies, which is often.
A lot of folks and individuals and groups who claim to have encountered UFOs are called crazies.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think
let's end that here, right?
I think the issue with the UFOs and a lot of the groups that I study is they have the double and sometimes triple burden because they're also Black.
Exactly.
And so they're also embodied in such a way where their ways of knowing are automatically cast in doubt. They're not educated, scientific white men or astronauts or whatever embodiment we consider authoritative that we take more seriously. And so the Nation of Islam is part of a larger group that I want to understand is a very different tradition of ufology, of UFO encounters.
Yeah.
There are a lot of groups But even within that particular group, the UFO, the Nation of Islam sees themselves as unique. They see the UFO, or what they call the mother wheel or the mother plane, as uniquely related to Black people in America, and specifically to the Nation of Islam. Now, Black in the Nation of Islam, I've always said it's really complicated what Black means, because in their mythology, which they understand historically and scientifically, right? I'm calling it mythology.
Sure. Yeah.
They understand Native Americans, Asians, Latinx people, and so on to be Black. So it's a really expansive way of understanding Blackness. It's not just Africans or African Americans or Caribbeans or so on, but they see the UFO experience as uniquely related to Black people and to the Nation of Islam, and to the Nation of Islam's role in bringing about justice for Black people in this world, but also a new reality, potentially a new reality for America. And they're always very misunderstood, as are many people who claim to have seen UFOs.
Absolutely.
They're double or triple misunderstood because of race and social status and those type of things.
And people tend to look at difference as a threat, and they are proud and loud. And I think that threatens a lot of people, you know?
That's exactly right. But what allows them to be loud and proud is the point that I led with. It's because they see Black identity as intricately and intimately linked to these UFOs, which they want to understand in scientific and technological terms, which means then that Black, and here it is again, it's not inferior, but Black is a expansive reservoir of technological, scientific knowledge about the nature of the universe. So the exact opposite maybe of how the current order regards Black people and what we might understand as Black knowledge about the world.
Sort of an evolutionary vanguard or whatever, like out front.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Not just evolutionary, but in many ways premier. Mm-hmm. Right? Like for the Nation of Islam, if you really want to understand the UFO phenomena, for them, we should all be talking to them. Yeah. They have something specific to offer the world about what this means.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what people probably miss. And when they don't miss it, that probably is what offends them. Again, because we want to see, on the one hand, UFO phenomena as universal. They see it as particular. And then on the other hand, we don't want to see Black people as having something ultimate to say about the world. We may not admit that, but we're going to have problems with that. They're not white. Yeah. They're not scientists, right? They're Black religious folks who say they have something ultimate to talk to the world. So U.S. government should be talking to them if they really want to understand this stuff. Right?
Amen to that. Yeah. Well, that sort of, leads into the next question, though, about the U.S. government, and we can call this our last question.
Sure.
Disclosure, right? Trust me, the government says. I will tell you the truth. Well, if any group of people in the history of America understands that the government can be duplicitous and a lot of other things, it's the Black community.
Oh, my goodness, yes.
Does that make you view disclosure in a different light, or potentially trust less the notion that the government will ever really come clean? Or how does that inform you, I guess?
It's a really good question with a very complicated answer. Sure. That's really tough as the final answer, final question to an interview.
Sorry.
Because I've also had the privilege of being in some very private conversations where I've had access maybe to some data and knowledge that maybe folks in general haven't been able to access.
Okay.
And so there's that on the one hand. On the other hand, my experience as an African-American male in particular, where we haven't always had these ecological ways of understanding ourselves. We've always been pathologized and criminalized, where the groups you're talking about, the FBI and so on, have always been used over against us in movements that only sought freedom and more rights and justice. And so we're always going to hold disclosure and government reports with suspicion, and yet I'm still interested in what they have to say, and I read those. Like that report that came out in 2020 was really, really important to me with the what is it, the task force, the UAP task force.
The UAP task force, yeah.
Yeah.
Before Arrow.
That was established. Yep. I mean, those kind of things are always important to me. And yet, as an African American with particular experience in the world, with government, law enforcement in particular, not just groups like the FBI, I'm always going to be suspicious. I'm always going to view them through that lens, and try to make sense of them at the same time.
Excellent. Can I ask what, I mean, obviously you probably can't tell me, but what special information did you, or how does it relate, I guess, is maybe a way to approach it?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can say, because of a lot of the groups that I've been in, the research groups, which have been interdisciplinary, are also really, really private, where we have to respect not just the people who are there giving the information, but the people who make up the group, who are in various institutions and academic disciplines. And I can only say that I appreciate those groups. I can't say a lot about them, who makes them up, where some of the information comes from. Some of it is academic. Some of it, I'll just say, is also governmental. And I've been fortunate to be able to learn and to have access to some of that data.
Yeah, I mean, so another way for me to approach it real quick before we sign off is that there seems to be, and you can just say yes or no, that there are ongoing sessions, sort of like thinking groups made up of various folks from private sector, academia, and government who are getting together and taking this seriously, and they represent some of the cream of the crop, and they are all taking this issue very, very seriously. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say, and I'm a member of at least 3 of those groups,
okay.
Those collectives.
Wow. See, I mean, that just goes again to the underlying reality of all this. I mean, people aren't going to waste their time and energy and professional bona fides if there's not something there.
That's right. Totally agree.
Is there anything I didn't ask about that you'd like to include that I should have asked about?
I'll just say that I appreciate your time and being able to be on the show. I appreciate the considerate and insightful questions that allowed us to have a very fair and broad conversation about UFOs and about African Americans and UFOs and groups like the Nation of Islam. I really respect that. I really appreciate that. They have something to offer. And I think in terms of some of the important issues, I think we've raised and covered some really important ground here.
Excellent, sir. I appreciate you, and I'd like to have you back as I learn more and get more into your work. I was only able to do a surface level review, and I'd like to read your book and maybe talk again once I'm a little bit more educated on these topics.
Call me anytime. I'd be happy to talk about the book. I'd also be happy to appear with a few others where we might offer a broader discussion. Yeah. Whatever you like. I just appreciate your time and the resources that you've offered by having this conversation with me, and I'd be happy to help in the future.
All right, I'll be reaching out then. That sounds like permission. All right, well, thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you. Have a good day too.